A fishing boat drifts over the gray waters of the North Sea. The nets rise from the depths, heavy with something unexpected. Not fish, but a mammoth's tooth, a shaped flint blade. Fragments of a world that should not be here. 8,000 years ago, this was not sea. You could have walked from Britain to mainland Europe across a vast land of rivers, forests, and open plains. This place is known as Doggerland, a lost heart of Europe where animals roamed and people lived for thousands of years. Then the ice melted. The waters rose. The land slowly vanished beneath the waves. To find it again, we must look below the surface. Beneath the currents and cold darkness lies a preserved landscape, hidden but not gone. We are not just diving into the ocean. We are descending into time itself. The greatest challenge in understanding Doggerland is not distance, nor age, nor even imagination. It is invisibility. This world did not leave behind ruins that rise above the horizon. There are no standing walls, no weathered temples, no carved stones waiting to be rediscovered. Instead, everything lies flattened beneath layers of sediment, pressed gently into the seabed by thousands of years of tides, currents, and silence. On land, history often reveals itself dramatically. Deserts preserve footprints. Jungles conceal cities that can still be uncovered with a machete and patience. But the ocean behaves differently. Water does not simply cover, it transforms. It softens edges, redistributes soil, carries grains of sand across vast distances, and settles them like a slow snowfall that never stops. Over centuries, objects sink. Over millennia, landscapes dissolve into contourless plains. The North Sea is not a clear, tropical basin where sunlight illuminates coral and stone. It is a cold, restless environment. Visibility is often measured in inches. Fine silts, carried by powerful tidal systems, remain suspended in the water, turning it opaque. Even when the sea is calm, the bottom is rarely still. It shifts, breathes, and rearranges itself constantly. Imagine trying to preserve a memory by writing it on the surface of water. That is the difficulty faced by archaeologists searching for Doggerland. Yet the scale of what is hidden there is immense. Doggerland was not a narrow strip of land. At its height, it stretched across an area larger than the modern United Kingdom. It connected what are now separate nations into a continuous ecological world. Britain was not an island. It was the western highland of a continental plain. The English Channel did not exist. The North Sea, as we know it, had not yet been born. Instead, there was a vast lowland basin, shaped by ancient glaciers that had advanced and retreated many times before. These glaciers carved valleys, pushed up ridges, and left behind rich soils composed of ground stone and mineral dust. When the ice finally withdrew at the end of the last ice age, it revealed a landscape ready for life. Rivers formed quickly, fed by meltwater. Some were enormous, combining the flow of what are now separate European rivers into single channels that crossed the plain before draining into a distant ocean far to the north. These waterways meandered through marshes and braided into wetlands, creating habitats dense with fish, birds, and vegetation. Forests followed. First came hardy pioneer species, birch and willow, spreading across open ground. Then, as the climate warmed, oak, elm, hazel, and pine took root. Over centuries, these trees formed thick canopies. The land became a mosaic of woodland, meadow, and water, a dynamic environment shaped by seasonal flooding and animal migrations. To stand in Doggerland during this time would have been to experience abundance. Herds moved along predictable routes. Edible plants grew in staggering variety. Fresh water was everywhere. For human communities emerging from the harsh conditions of the Ice Age, this region was not marginal land. It was an ecological center, a place where survival did not demand constant struggle, but instead allowed adaptation, innovation, and stability. And yet, this thriving world existed on borrowed time. The same glaciers that created the land also sealed its fate. Their melting did not simply stop when the ice disappeared from view. Across the globe, vast quantities of frozen water were returning to the oceans. Sea levels began to rise, not in a sudden surge, but in a long, uneven progression that lasted thousands of years. At first, the changes were subtle. A marsh that stayed wet longer into the summer. A shoreline that crept inland by a few meters each generation. A river mouth that widened into an estuary. For the people living there, these shifts may have seemed like ordinary variations in weather and season, but the rise never reversed. The geography of Doggerland made it especially vulnerable. Much of the region was low-lying, only a few meters above the ancient sea level. It had been shaped by glacial pressure into a gently sloping plain. As the water advanced, it did not encounter cliffs or barriers. It simply spread. Coastlines lengthened and fractured. Hills became islands. Valleys became tidal channels. What had once been interior forest slowly transformed to coastal wetland. This was not a single catastrophic flood, at least not at first. It was a drawn-out transformation that unfolded over generations. A child might have played beneath trees that by the time he became an elder stood at the water's edge. Knowledge had to adapt continuously. Hunting grounds disappeared. New fishing techniques became necessary. Travel routes shifted toward higher terrain. Archaeologists sometimes describe Doggerland's end as drowning, but drowning suggests a suddenness that obscures the true complexity of what happened. This was a negotiation between land and sea that lasted centuries, perhaps millennia. A world did not vanish overnight. It was gradually persuaded to surrender. All the while, the sea was performing its second role as eraser. As water covered the terrain, it also protected and concealed it. Oxygen levels dropped within the buried soils, slowing decay. Peat formed in waterlogged forests, locking tree roots in place. Layers of clay and silt settled above them, sealing entire ecosystems beneath anoxic blankets. In some areas, this created astonishing preservation. Wood that would have rotted to nothing on land survived intact underwater. But preservation without visibility is a paradox. The evidence remained, yet no one could see it. For thousands of years after Doggerland disappeared, waves passed over its hidden hills without revealing what lay below. Human memory retained no clear account of the lost land. Myths of floods appear in many cultures, but the specific knowledge of this European plain faded entirely. By the time written history began, the transformation was already ancient. The sea had done its work so thoroughly that even its existence was forgotten. Only in the last century did scattered clues begin to reappear. Fishermen noticed that their nets sometimes snagged on hardened surfaces far below. They hauled up peat clumps, tree fragments, and bones, unlike those of modern marine animals. These were not curiosities washed from distant shores. They came from directly beneath their boats. Each find hinted at something vast and coherent, but no one could yet see the full picture. Mapping the seabed revealed only smooth expanses shaped by currents. The landscape itself remained hidden beneath layers of deposited material, like a painting buried under repeated coats of plaster. This is the essential obstacle in studying Doggerland. It is not lost in the sense of being destroyed. It is lost in the sense of being covered, muted, and rendered unreadable without extraordinary effort. To reconstruct, it requires tools capable of penetrating sediment, interpreting echoes, and translating subtle geological signals into images of vanished terrain. Researchers must think less like traditional archaeologists and more like forensic investigators examining a sealed crime scene. They cannot simply dig where they choose. The North Sea is vast, harsh, and economically active. Shipping lanes cross it. Energy infrastructure anchors into it. Weather limits access for much of the year. Every investigation must contend with tides, storms, and darkness, all while attempting to detect traces of forests, rivers, and settlements that lie buried meters below the seabed. And yet, Despite these obstacles, the outline of Doggerland has begun to emerge. Not through dramatic excavation, but through patient accumulation of data. A valley identified here. A preserved tree line discovered there. A scatter of tools dragged accidentally to the surface. Each fragment adds resolution to an invisible map. The process is slow because the landscape itself resists revelation. The sea does not willingly give up its past. It demands technology, persistence, and imagination strong enough to interpret faint signals as evidence of entire ecosystems. To study Doggerland is to accept that the past is not always waiting in ruins. Sometimes it lies in silence, diffused across sediments, hidden in textures and densities that must be translated before they can be understood. We are not looking for a sunken city. We are searching for a drowned world whose boundaries blur into geology itself. And that world is still there, stretched beneath the North Sea, intact in form yet concealed from sight, waiting to be assembled piece by piece from the faintest of echoes. If we could remove the water of the North Sea in a single moment, what would appear would not be an empty basin, but a landscape. A vast, rolling expanse marked by river channels, low hills, and shallow depressions where lakes once gathered. The seabed would not look alien. It would look familiar. It would resemble the lanes of eastern England or the northern Netherlands, because it was once part of the same continuous terrain. This is one of the most disorienting truths about Doggerland. It is not a mythical place. It is not an Atlantis of imagination. It was ordinary land, shaped by the same geological forces that shape the coasts we know today. People did not see it as a bridge between places. They saw it as home. The animals that roamed there followed seasonal rhythms older than humanity itself. In the spring, herds moved toward fresh vegetation along river floodplains. In the autumn, they returned to sheltered forests. Predators tracked these migrations. Birds nested in wetlands that stretched for miles. The soundscape would have been constant and alive with movement. Wind in leaves, insects in the grasses, water flowing across stones. Human groups adapted themselves to this richness. They were neither isolated nor static. Doggerland's position made it a crossroads. Communities could move freely across enormous distances, sharing knowledge, tools, and genetic heritage. Ideas did not have to cross seas. They traveled along rivers and across open ground. Stone tools found in what is now Britain show connections to techniques used on the European mainland, and Doggerland was the corridor through which those connections flowed. It allowed populations to remain in contact, to exchange resources, to adapt collectively to the changing post-Ice Age environment. But as the climate continued to warm, the transformation of this landscape accelerated. The melting of distant ice sheets caused pulses of sea level rise known today as meltwater events. These were not steady increases, but episodes in which the ocean advanced more rapidly, sometimes over the span of only a few generations. Shorelines migrated inland. Estuaries expanded. Freshwater habitats slowly became brackish. To the people living there, the change would have been visible, but not fully comprehensible. A favorite hunting ground became unreliable. A familiar forest began to die as salt crept into the soil. Storm surges reached further than they once had. Each year, the difference was small. Over a lifetime, it was undeniable. This created a pattern of gradual retreat. Archaeological evidence suggests that populations did not abandon Doggerland all at once. Instead, they shifted repeatedly toward higher ground, adjusting their movements to match the encroaching sea. Campsites moved, pathways changed. Knowledge of the land had to be constantly updated, as though the map itself refused to stay still. The psychological experience of this slow loss is difficult to reconstruct. There was no single moment when inhabitants would have declared that their world was ending. Rather, they lived through a series of adjustments, each one practical, each one necessary. Only in hindsight would the full scale of the change become clear. Meanwhile, The sea continued its quiet work of concealment. As waters spread across the plains, they carried sediments eroded from distant coasts and river systems. These particles settled into depressions, burying vegetation, tools, and animal remains. Over time, entire surfaces were sealed beneath protective layers. Peat formed where forests drowned in place, locking tree trunks upright in the soils where they had grown. Unlike ruins exposed to weather, these buried environments entered a kind of suspended state. Oxygen vanished. Bacteria slowed. Decay nearly stopped. In some areas, the preservation became so complete that individual leaves, pollen grains, and insect remains survived, trapped like messages inside a geological archive. But this archive had no obvious entrance. For thousands of years, ships crossed these waters unaware of the records below. The North Sea became one of the busiest maritime regions in the world, a place of trade, conflict, and industry. Its surface was intensely human, while its depths remained entirely prehistoric. Even modern science struggled to recognize what lay beneath. Early seabed surveys were designed for navigation, not archaeology. They mapped hazards, not histories. It was only when unusual materials kept appearing in fishing nets that attention shifted. These were not random objects. They formed patterns that hinted at submerged ecosystems. Gradually, a realization took shape. The fishermen were unintentionally sampling a buried continent. Yet even with this knowledge, accessing Doggerland remained extraordinarily difficult. Traditional excavation methods cannot simply be transferred underwater at such scale. Visibility is poor. Conditions are harsh. The area itself is immense. Investigating it requires interpreting indirect evidence, traces detected through sound waves, sediment cores, and scattered finds. This means that Doggerland is reconstructed not through dramatic discoveries, but through accumulation. A piece of worked flint suggests human presence. A preserved tree stump indicates a former forest. Pollen analysis reveals climate conditions. Each fragment is small on its own, but together they allow scientists to rebuild entire environments. It is a process more like assembling memory than uncovering ruins. The challenge also forces a different kind of imagination. On land, we can stand inside ancient structures and feel their scale directly. Under the North Sea, scale must be inferred. Researchers read patterns in data the way historians read texts. Subtle shifts in sediment density may indicate an ancient riverbank. Variations in mineral composition may trace the outline of a vanished shoreline. Through these methods, the invisible becomes slowly visible. We now understand that Doggerland was not a marginal zone overwhelmed by inevitable flooding. It was a thriving landscape that endured for thousands of years during a time of dramatic environmental change. Its disappearance was neither instantaneous nor entirely predictable. It was the result of interacting forces, climate warming, glacial melt, shifting coastlines, and eventually catastrophic events that would deliver the final blows. What makes Doggerland extraordinary is not only that it vanished, but that it vanished so completely from cultural memory. Entire generations lived and died there, shaping traditions and knowledge systems now erased from direct record. The sea did not just claim the land, it claimed the stories tied to it. And yet, those stories were not destroyed. They were archived in silence. Today, when scientists examine samples drawn from the seabed, they are reading chapters written in pollen, isotopes, and sediments. Each layer corresponds to a season, a climate phase, a human adaptation. The drowned world still exists as information, waiting to be translated. This is why Doggerland is often described as Europe's hidden prehistory. It represents a missing geographical center, a place that once connected regions we now think of as separate. Understanding it reshapes how we understand migration, culture, and survival at the end of the last ice age. The obstacle, then, is not simply that Doggerland lies underwater. The obstacle is learning how to perceive a landscape that cannot be seen directly, how to reconstruct a human world from geological whispers. Beneath the busy shipping routes and wind farms of the modern North Sea, beneath the churn of tides and storms, the outline of that ancient terrain remains intact. Valleys still lie where rivers once flowed. Forest soils still hold the roots of trees that have not felt air in 8,000 years. The land is still there. It is just waiting beneath the weight of the sea, preserved in darkness, while we slowly learn how to uncover its shape without ever lifting the water that hides it. The reconstruction of Doggerland did not begin in a laboratory. It began on the decks of fishing boats. For more than a century, trawlers have dragged heavy nets across the floor of the North Sea, searching for cod, plaice, and herring. Their equipment does not move delicately. It scrapes, gathers, and lifts whatever lies in its path. Most of what comes up is expected: fish, shell fragments, tangled seaweed, debris from modern shipping. But mixed within this ordinary haul, something else appears. A dark clump of peat, a section of ancient wood, a massive tooth worn flat by a prehistoric jaw, a shard of flint shaped by human hands. To the fishermen, these objects were once nothing more than curiosities or obstacles. They were the unwanted weight in the net, the hardened lump that had to be shaken free before the next cast. Some were tossed back into the sea. Others were kept as odd souvenirs, displayed in harbor pubs or passed down as strange tokens from the deep. But taken together, these finds form something extraordinary. They form a museum without walls. Unlike traditional archaeological sites, Doggerland cannot be excavated in a grid, layer by layer. Instead, it is sampled accidentally, unpredictably, through the daily routines of commercial fishing. Each trawler becomes an unintentional research vessel. Each net becomes a blind probe sweeping across buried terrain. When researchers began cataloging what fishermen were bringing ashore, patterns emerged. The finds were not random. They clustered in specific areas. Certain banks yielded more bones. Certain tracks produced repeated fragments of worked stone. In some zones, peat appeared frequently, dense and fibrous, unmistakably terrestrial in origin. Peat does not form at the bottom of an open ocean. It forms in wetlands, in forests where water saturates the soil and plant material accumulates slowly without fully decaying. The presence of peat in fishing nets was a quiet but decisive clue. Beneath the sea lay former marshes and woodlands, preserved as if pressed between pages. Fishermen also reported snagging their gear on solid features below, ridges or hardened surfaces that did not match the soft sediments expected in many parts of the North Sea. Some described pulling up tree trunks with roots still attached, as though they had been uprooted yesterday rather than 8,000 years ago. Over time, collaboration began to grow between marine scientists, archaeologists, and fishing communities. Instead of discarding unusual finds, crews were encouraged to document them. Coordinates were recorded. Specimens were sent to universities and museums for analysis. This transformed the fishing fleet into a distributed network of observers. The sea, which had erased the visible surface of Doggerland, was slowly revealing fragments of its buried core. Among the most dramatic discoveries were bones of Ice Age animals. Mammoth tusks emerged from nets, their ivory stained dark by centuries underwater. Rhinoceros skull fragments, heavy and unmistakable, were dredged from specific banks. Even remains of prehistoric predators appeared, silent evidence of ecosystems that once stretched across open plains. Each bone carried information. Isotopic analysis could reveal what those animals had eaten. Microscopic wear patterns could indicate age and behavior. Radiocarbon dating placed them within a timeline of climatic transition. These were not isolated relics. They were data points mapping an entire vanished biome. Flint tools were equally telling. Unlike bones, which might drift or be scattered by currents before burial, stone artifacts often remained close to where they were used or discarded. A shaped blade, a scraper, a core from which smaller tools were struck, these were unmistakable signs of human presence. When fishermen brought up worked flint, they were not retrieving random stones. They were retrieving moments of decision. A hunter shaping a cutting edge beside a river. A craftsperson preparing tools for a journey. A community leaving behind the debris of daily life. What makes this process remarkable is its fragmentation. No single trawler ever recovers a complete scene. Instead, pieces surface separately, scattered across years and vessels. One boat brings up a mammoth tooth. Another, months later, hauls up a shaped antler point. A third recovers peat embedded with pollen grains. Individually, each object is incomplete. Together, they form a composite image. It is as if the sea has broken a vast painting into thousands of small fragments and distributed them randomly across its floor. The fishing nets lift these fragments one by one. Archaeologists must then determine how they fit together. This is forensic work in the truest sense. Investigators cannot question witnesses or examine standing structures. They rely on material traces, on the subtle clues left by life and preserved by unusual circumstances. They reconstruct landscapes from sediment cores and animal remains. They infer human movement from the distribution of tools. The unpredictability of the finds also shapes the narrative. Unlike a planned excavation, where a site is chosen for its visible promise, Doggerland reveals itself without warning. A routine haul may suddenly contain an artifact that shifts understanding. A bone dated slightly earlier than expected can extend the known occupation of a region by centuries. In this way, the North Sea becomes both archive and filter. It has preserved elements of the past with astonishing fidelity, yet it releases them irregularly, according to chance and industry. The rhythm of discovery follows the rhythm of fishing seasons, not academic calendars. There is something deeply symbolic about this process. The modern economy of the North Sea, built on fish, shipping, and energy extraction, operates directly above the economic life of its prehistoric predecessor. Where trawlers now follow sonar to locate shoals, ancient hunters once followed herds across dry land. Where oil platforms drill into sediment layers, those same layers contain pollen from forests long drowned. The present floats upon the past, often unaware of its foundation. As more artifacts accumulated, the idea of Doggerland shifted from speculation to certainty. It was no longer a theoretical land bridge suggested by bathymetric charts. It was a lived-in environment evidenced by tools, bones, and plant remains. It was a continent assembled from what had once been dismissed as marine debris. The fishermen themselves became part of the story. Some began to recognize the shapes of ancient bones as readily as they recognized fish species. A curved tusk fragment or a heavy molar no longer seemed mysterious. It was another kind of catch, one that connected their daily labor to a deeper human timeline. In harbors along the British and Dutch coasts, small collections formed. Shelves displayed mammoth teeth alongside modern nautical instruments. Conversations in dockside bars included not only weather forecasts and market prices, but also the age of a newly discovered artifact. This blending of worlds is fitting. Doggerland was once a center of connection, and its rediscovery relies on cooperation across disciplines and communities. Scientists depend on fishermen. Fishermen contribute to science. Together, they assemble the outline of a submerged landmass from scattered remains. The trawler's museum has no ticket booth and no central gallery. Its exhibits are dispersed across ports, laboratories, and storage rooms. Its catalog is incomplete and always growing. Yet it holds the first clear echoes of a world that the sea tried to silence. From nets heavy with unexpected weight, a continent begins to rise again in fragments. Among the most haunting discoveries linked to Doggerland are not bones or tools, but trees. Along stretches of the Norfolk coastline, particularly after strong storms that scour away layers of sand, strange shapes sometimes emerge at low tide. Dark forms appear against the wet surface, circular patterns arranged in quiet clusters. At first glance, they seem like stones. But as the water drains away, their true nature becomes clear. They are tree stumps, not fossilized stone replicas, but real wood. Ancient oak, pine, and alder, preserved rather than petrified. Their grain is still visible. Their roots still spread outward into the soil in which they once grew. Some can even be cut, revealing fibrous interiors that had survived for thousands of years beneath layers of silt. These are the remains of forests that once stood in open air. When Doggerland existed, this region formed part of a vast boreal woodland stretching across the low plains of northwestern Europe. The climate, gradually warming after the last ice age, supported dense growth. Trees anchored themselves in rich, waterlogged soils. Understory plants filled the gaps between trunks. Mosses and ferns thrived in the damp shade. Now those same forests lie submerged. The preservation is so complete because of how they were buried. As sea levels rose, salt water slowly infiltrated the land, drowning the trees where they stood. Sediments carried by tides then blanketed the area, sealing the wood in oxygen-poor conditions. Without oxygen, the organisms that normally break down organic material could not function. Decay slowed almost to a halt. Time did not erase the forest. It paused it. When divers and researchers examine these submerged landscapes, they describe an uncanny stillness. The trees are not scattered as driftwood would be. They remain upright or only slightly collapsed, rooted in their original positions. The geometry of a living forest is still legible, as though the tide had risen yesterday rather than millennia ago. Imagine moving through such a place. Light filters weakly through the cloudy water above. Fish glide between trunks that once held birds' nests. Crabs trace paths across ancient root systems. The seafloor is not flat, but textured, shaped by the same organic patterns that defined it in life. It is a forest transformed, not destroyed. This is why these sites are often called submerged forests rather than fossil beds. Fossils suggest mineral replacement and geological deep time. Doggerland's trees are something else. They are relics of a relatively recent world, preserved in a state that still feels biologically familiar. Analysis of the wood provides extraordinary detail about that lost environment. Tree rings reveal seasonal growth patterns, showing years of abundance and years of stress. Pollen trapped in surrounding sediments identifies nearby plant species, allowing scientists to reconstruct entire ecosystems. Even insect remains found in the soil offer clues to temperature and moisture levels. From these quiet stumps, researchers can infer the soundscape of Doggerland: wind moving through leaves, the presence of wetlands alive with birds, the rustle of large mammals passing through undergrowth. The forest was not marginal. It was dense, productive, and stable enough to support long-term human activity. These drowned woodlands also demonstrate how gradual the transformation of Doggerland must have been. Trees do not grow overnight. The oaks found off Norfolk lived for centuries before being overtaken by rising seas. Their existence proves that this land supported mature ecosystems for long periods during the transition from Ice Age to modern climate. The sea did not conquer an empty wasteland. It advanced into thriving terrain. For coastal communities today, the appearance of these stumps after storms can feel almost like an unveiling. For a few hours, the boundary between present and prehistory thins. Walkers on the beach stand where hunters may once have walked, separated not by distance, but by time and water. Then the tide returns. Sand shifts again. The forest disappears from view. This rhythm of revelation and concealment mirrors the broader story of Doggerland itself. The evidence is there, tangible and grounded, yet only visible under rare conditions. It reminds us that the seabed is not merely geology. It is landscape preserved in darkness. These underwater forests are among the clearest signatures that Doggerland was once alive with complex ecosystems. They show us not a barren corridor between continents, but a green, inhabited world whose trees still stand, waiting silently beneath the waves. If the submerged forests reveal the quiet life of Doggerland, another region reveals its grandeur. In the middle of the North Sea lies an area known today as Doggerbank. To modern sailors, it is simply a shallow expanse, a place where the sea floor rises closer to the surface than in the surrounding waters. Waves break differently here. Currents shift. It is one of the most productive fishing grounds in Europe. But long before it became a fishing hotspot, Doggerbank was something else entirely. It was high ground. When sea levels were lower, this area formed a broad plateau overlooking the surrounding plains of Doggerland. Rather than being submerged beneath dozens of meters of water, it stood as a sweeping landscape of grassland and open woodland, elevated just enough to remain dry, even as surrounding regions began to flood. It was a place of vantage, stability, and extraordinary ecological richness. The evidence for this comes not from maps, but from bones. For decades, trawlers working over Doggerbank have dredged up an astonishing quantity of Ice Age animal remains. Mammoth tusks, sometimes several meters long, teeth worn from grinding coarse vegetation, bones of woolly rhinoceroses, steppe bison, reindeer, and even the great predators that once followed them, lions and hyenas adapted to cold environments. These are not the scattered remains of a few wandering animals. The density of finds suggests something far more significant. Doggerbank was not merely crossed by migrating herds. It sustained them. This was grazing land on a massive scale. During the late Ice Age and the warming period that followed, the plateau offered a mix of open grasslands and sheltered areas, ideal for large herbivores. Seasonal plants flourished in nutrient-rich soils, left behind by retreating glaciers. Water sources were plentiful, but not overwhelming, creating a balance between pasture and accessibility. Scientists sometimes describe this environment using a modern comparison. It was the Serengeti of prehistoric Europe. Herds would have gathered here in great numbers, moving in cycles dictated by climate and vegetation. Where herbivores gathered, predators followed. The entire food web operated across this elevated terrain, creating one of the most biologically productive regions of its time. Human communities understood this pattern well. For hunter-gatherers, such concentrations of animals represented opportunity. Rather than wandering endlessly in search of prey, they could return seasonally to known locations where herds reliably passed. Archaeological evidence suggests repeated human presence in areas surrounding Doggerbank, indicating that it functioned as both hunting ground and navigational landmark within the wider landscape. Stone tools dredged from the region often show signs of heavy use, resharpened edges, and purposeful shaping suited for processing large animals. These were not us losses. They were the discarded instruments of organized subsistence. The plateau likely also offered visibility across great distances. From its higher elevations, ancient inhabitants could have watched animal movements, weather patterns, and the shifting edges of wetlands below. In a world without permanent structures, geography itself provided orientation. Doggerbank may have served as a central reference point within Doggerland's mental map. As sea levels continued to rise, this high ground became one of the last refuges of the shrinking landmass. Lower plains transformed into marsh and tidal channels, but Doggerbank remained above water longer, forming a kind of residual island landscape. Over generations, it may have appeared increasingly isolated, surrounded by expanding estuaries. What had once been a central plateau gradually became a diminishing stronghold against the encroaching sea. Eventually, even this refuge could not resist the transformation. Water covered the grasslands. Sediment settled across the surface. The animals vanished, their remains buried where they fell. The plateau that had once supported entire ecosystems became the shallow seabed known to fishermen today. Yet it continues to give up its evidence. Each tusk raised from Doggerbank is a reminder that this was not an empty corridor between continents. It was a thriving habitat capable of sustaining megafauna in enormous numbers. The scale of life here challenges the outdated idea of Doggerland as merely a temporary land bridge used for migration. It was not a bridge. It was a destination. The repeated discovery of animal remains also allows scientists to reconstruct climatic conditions with remarkable precision. Chemical signatures in bones reveal what plants those animals consumed, which in turn reflects temperature, rainfall, and seasonal variation. Through these analyses, researchers can trace the gradual environmental shifts that accompanied the end of the Ice Age. In this way, Dogger Bank serves as both ecological archive and geographic anchor. It tells us where the land stood highest, where life gathered most densely, and how long the landscape remained viable as surrounding regions succumbed to rising seas. Today, fishing vessels pass over this area, unaware that beneath their hulls once stretched windswept plains filled with movement and sound. Nets descend through water that was once air. Sonar scans the outline of a plateau that mammoths once crossed on foot. Dogger Bank is no longer visible as land, but its identity has not been erased. It persists in the remains it yields, in the subtle rise of the seabed, and in the story those clues assemble. Here, more than anywhere else, we see the scale of what Doggerland truly was. Not a narrow passage, but a vast and fertile world, capable of sustaining life on a grand and dynamic level before the waters came to claim it. Bones tell us animals lived here. Trees tell us forests stood here. But one object tells us something deeper. In 1931, a fishing trawler working in the North Sea hauled up an unusual artifact tangled in its nets. It was not stone. It was not bone shaped by chance. It was a carefully crafted point made from red deer antler, carved with deliberate precision and lined with sharp barbs along one side. This object would later become known as the Colinda harpoon. Radiocarbon dating places it at roughly 12,000 years old, making it older than the final submergence of Doggerland. It belonged to a time when the landscape was still open, when rivers flowed freely across the plain and herds moved across grasslands that no longer exist. The harpoon is small enough to hold in one hand, yet its implications are immense. Each barb was cut intentionally, angled to catch in flesh and prevent escape. The shaft end was shaped for secure attachment to a wooden pole. The symmetry suggests not improvisation, but skill refined over generations. This was not the work of a desperate survivor. It was the work of a master craftsperson. Tools like this require planning. The antler had to be selected at the right stage of growth. It had to be cut, shaped, and polished using stone implements. The maker understood material properties, balance, and hydrodynamics. This was technology adapted specifically for fishing or hunting aquatic animals, perhaps in the rivers and wetlands that crisscrossed Doggerland. The Colinda harpoon proves something essential. The people of Doggerland were not wandering aimlessly across a barren land bridge. They were settled within a resource-rich environment. They developed specialized equipment suited to their terrain. They possessed intimate knowledge of animal behavior, water systems, and seasonal cycles. They were innovators. The presence of barbed antler points suggests a culture comfortable with water. These communities likely fished in lakes and rivers, using boats or rafts to navigate channels. They exploited both terrestrial and aquatic resources, adapting fluidly as shoreline shifted and wetlands expanded. When sea levels rose, such skills would have been crucial. A population already experienced in watercraft and fishing would have been better equipped to adjust to a changing landscape. The harpoon, then, is not just a weapon. It is evidence of resilience. Its survival is almost miraculous. Organic materials usually decay rapidly, especially in exposed environments. But like the submerged forests, the harpoon was preserved in the oxygen-poor sediments of the seabed. The same conditions that sealed tree roots and peat layers also protected this human creation. When it surfaced in 1931, it carried with it the touch of hands long gone. You can imagine the moment it was made. A hunter seated beside a riverbank, shaping antler under daylight, the sound of stone tools scraping, the smell of wet earth. Perhaps children watching, learning the method. Perhaps elders correcting the angle of each barb. The finished tool would have represented both survival and identity. Techniques were passed down. Styles differed subtly between groups. Craft was not only functional, but cultural. Through objects like this, we glimpse not just activity, but tradition. The harpoon also anchors Doggerland firmly within the Mesolithic period, the era between the great Ice Age hunters and the later agricultural societies. This was a time of adaptation, of experimentation with new environments as glaciers retreated and ecosystems shifted. The people of Doggerland were at the forefront of that transformation. They lived in a land of plenty. Forests provided wood and game. Rivers offered fish. Wetlands yielded birds and edible plants. High plateaus like Dogger Bank supported large herds. In such an environment, innovation flourished. Tools became more refined. Social networks expanded. Communities were dynamic rather than static. The Colinda harpoon stands as a symbol of that dynamism. It tells us that when the waters finally advanced, they did not overwhelm a primitive population clinging to survival. They transformed the world of skilled, knowledgeable people deeply attuned to their environment. These were pioneers navigating a post-Ice Age Europe, adapting continuously to climatic change long before written history recorded such shifts. The loss of Doggerland was therefore not merely geographical. It was cultural. As rising seas fragmented the landscape, communities would have dispersed toward higher ground in what is now Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. They carried their knowledge with them, their techniques, their stories. The harpoon represents a lineage that did not vanish with the land. It migrated. When fishermen pulled that barbed antler point from the sea, they were lifting more than an artifact. They were retrieving a direct trace of human intention from a drowned continent. The human touch endures. Through bone tools shaped with care, through flint blades struck with precision, through the careful choice of materials and design, Doggerland's people speak across 12 millennia. Their land may rest beneath the North Sea, but their ingenuity remains visible, rising unexpectedly in the nets of modern vessels. From trees rooted in darkness to mammoth bones scattered across submerged plateaus, and finally to a single crafted harpoon, the forensic evidence converges on one conclusion. Doggerland was alive with ecosystems, with movement, with human skill. And though the sea has covered its surface, it has not erased its story. For thousands of years, Doggerland did not vanish all at once. It thinned gently. It shifted. It adapted to a rising sea that moved almost imperceptibly from generation to generation. Marsh replaced meadow. Estuary replaced riverbank. The transformation was steady, patient. Then, around 6200 BC, far to the north near the coast of present-day Norway, something immense unfolded beneath the ocean floor. Layers of sediment, deposited over millennia by retreating glaciers, had accumulated along the continental shelf. These layers were thick and heavy, resting quietly on a sloping seabed. Over time, pressure built silently within them, and at a certain moment, gravity completed its law work. A vast portion of that seabed began to slide. This event is known today as the Storegga Slide. It remains one of the largest underwater landslides ever identified or uncodified. Earth. Thousands of cubic kilometers of sediment moved in a single sweeping motion, descending into deeper Atlantic waters. In deeper waters, the waves generated by this shift would have passed almost unnoticed. The open ocean absorbed their motion with calm indifference. Far below the surface, currents continued their ancient rhythms. But as those waves traveled into the shallower basin of the North Sea, something changed. When waves enter shallow water, they slow. Their energy compresses. Their height increases. What began as a distant motion became, near the remaining lands of Doggerland, an immense and overwhelming surge. By this time, Doggerland was no longer a vast continuous plain. It had become a network of higher ridges and islands surrounded by expanding tidal waters. The sea had already claimed much of its lower terrain. What remained stood like quiet remnants of a fading continent. Imagine standing on one of those last high grounds. The air is still. The tide behaves strangely, drawing back farther than usual. The world seems to hold its breath as the horizon shifts. Then the water returns, not as chaos, but as irresistible force. A towering surge moves across wetlands and forests alike, reshaping everything in its path. Trees yield. Channels widen. Low ground dissolves into new inlets. The transformation is swift, but it is part of a larger rhythm, the earth adjusting its balance. Geological evidence across northern Europe preserves the memory of that day. In parts of Scotland and eastern England, unusual layers of sand lie far inland, deposited not by ordinary storms, but by a single powerful marine incursion. Beneath the North Sea, sediment layers show abrupt transitions, peat surfaces gently overlain by marine deposits that speak of sudden inundation. The record is quiet, but clear. The Storegga tsunami did not create the drowning of Doggerland on its own. Sea levels had already been rising for centuries, but this event likely marked a threshold. Narrow connections between remaining land fragments may have been erased in a single afternoon. Shallow crossings that once linked Britain to continental Europe may have slipped permanently beneath the water. The final bridge was likely severed. Afterward, the sea resumed its steady ascent. What had been fragmented became separated. What had been peninsulas became islands. Britain's isolation was no longer temporary, but enduring. For the people who lived through it, the experience would have been profound. They had already adapted to gradual change. They had shifted settlements inland, learned new fishing strategies, followed retreating herds. But this was different. It was not simply the sea advancing. It was the land itself being redefined. And yet, even this immense event settled into stillness. Once the surge passed, sediments began to fall back to the seabed. Suspended particles drifted downward like slow snow. Broken surfaces were blanketed. The ocean calmed. The transformation became part of the geological record. Today, when scientists extract cores from the seabed, they can see that moment preserved in layers, a distinct boundary, a shift in grain size, a marine deposit resting upon what was once soil. The earth remembers through stratigraphy. This is where the story returns to quiet. The Storegga Slide reminds us that Doggerland's disappearance was not only gradual, but punctuated by profound transformation. It anchors the narrative in measurable evidence, in sediment and slope stability, in wave dynamics and continental shelves. It also brings us back to the present. Beneath the steady surface of the North Sea, those layers remain undisturbed. The shock has long since passed. The water above is calm. Ships cross without sensing the history below. Wind farms rotate gently in the distance. Life continues. And deep beneath it all, the sediment holds the memory of that ancient surge, sealed in darkness, resting in silence. For centuries, Doggerland remained hidden not because it was destroyed, but because it could not be seen. The sea concealed it too well. Even when fishermen brought up bones and tools, the larger shape of the land remained abstract. Fragments told stories, but the full geography lay buried beneath layers of sediment and water. Then, unexpectedly, industry provided a new kind of vision. In the late 20th century, oil and gas companies began extensive surveys of the North Sea. Their goal was not archaeology. They were searching for hydrocarbons trapped deep beneath the seabed. To do this, they developed sophisticated seismic mapping technologies capable of penetrating far below the ocean floor. The method is elegant in its simplicity. Ships tow arrays of air guns that release controlled pulses of compressed air into the water. These pulses travel downward as sound waves, passing through layers of sediment and rock. When they encounter changes in density, such as the boundary between sand and clay, or sediment and bedrock. Part of the wave reflects back upward. Sensitive instruments record these returning echoes. By measuring the time it takes for sound to travel down and back, and by repeating the process thousands of times across vast grids, scientists can build detailed three-dimensional images of the subsurface. Originally, these images were used to locate energy reserves. But within the layered reflections, something else appeared. Researchers began to notice patterns that did not resemble geological randomness. They saw sinuous channels cutting across the seabed, shapes that matched the curves of ancient river valleys. They saw broad depressions with defined edges, consistent with former lakes. They saw raised ridges that once stood as hills above surrounding plains. The invisible landscape began to emerge. What fishing nets had sampled in fragments, seismic data revealed in continuity. Entire river systems, now buried hundreds of feet beneath the sea, could be traced from source to mouth. Floodplains appeared as wide, flat expanses in the data. Former coastlines could be mapped as subtle contours separating terrestrial sediments from marine deposits. For the first time, Doggerland could be seen not as scattered evidence, but as terrain. The collaboration between industry and academia grew gradually. Oil companies, possessing vast archives of seismic data, allowed researchers access to their surveys. Archaeologists and geologists reinterpreted datasets originally intended for drilling operations, searching not for oil reservoirs, but for human and ecological history. What they found reshaped understanding completely. One particularly striking revelation was the complexity of the river systems that once crossed Doggerland. These were not minor streams. Some channels were wide and deeply incised, indicating substantial flow. During the melting of the ice sheets, enormous volumes of fresh water drained across this plain, carving networks that rivaled major European rivers today. These waterways would have been lifelines for human communities. They offered fresh water, fish, transport routes, and fertile soils along their banks. Seismic imaging shows how these rivers braided and merged, forming dynamic landscapes that changed with seasonal floods. In other regions, circular and oval depressions appeared in the data, interpreted as ancient lakes. Some were small and shallow. Others spanned significant distances. Their shorelines can still be traced beneath the sediment layers, preserved as subtle shifts in acoustic reflection. Around these lakes, one can imagine campsites, fishing grounds, and gathering places. Water attracts life. It organizes movement. It anchors memory. Seismic mapping also revealed the higher elevations of Doggerland with remarkable clarity. The plateau of Dogger Bank stands out in relief, confirming that it once formed a central highland. From these elevations, the land would have sloped gently toward surrounding valleys and wetlands. The technology allows researchers to slice through the seabed virtually, layer by layer. They can isolate specific time periods by identifying sediment boundaries associated with known sea level changes. In effect, they can rewind the landscape, reconstructing what it looked like before successive marine transgressions covered it. This is archaeology without excavation. Instead of digging downward physically, scientists navigate through digital cross-sections. They trace buried contours as if flying above them. They measure slope angles, valley depths, and basin shapes. The result is a topographic model of a continent that no longer exists in open air. Today, it is possible to generate digital reconstructions of Doggerland based on seismic data and geological modeling. Researchers can simulate water levels at different points in prehistory, watching coastlines migrate across the virtual plain. They can identify potential habitation zones, areas that remain dry longest or that offered strategic advantages. We can now walk through Doggerland digitally. On a screen, ancient rivers glow in colored relief. Hills rise from the seabed as they once did from soil. Lake basins appear where fish once swam beneath open skies. The lost landscape becomes navigable again, not by boat, but by data. There is something quietly poetic about this development. The same technology designed to extract fossil fuels from beneath the North Sea has revealed a fossilized world above those reserves. The industrial present, probing deep for energy, has illuminated the prehistoric past. Seismic mapping also provides context for events like the Storegga tsunami. By understanding the precise shape of the seabed before and after the event, scientists can model how waves would have traveled, which areas would have been most vulnerable, and how coastlines were reshaped. In this way, geology becomes both archive and simulation. The invisible obstacle that once defined Doggerland research is no longer absolute. We cannot drain the North Sea. We cannot walk physically across its submerged plains. But we can see through the sediment with sound. We can reconstruct valleys and shorelines from echoes. The drowned world gains dimension. It is important to remember that these images are interpretations. They are built from reflections, from differences in density translated into visual form. Yet they are precise enough to anchor serious research. They allow targeted sampling, guiding where sediment cores should be taken and where artifacts are most likely to be found. The work is ongoing. Each new survey refines the picture. Each dataset adds detail to the contours of hills and the branching of rivers. Slowly, the map of Doggerland becomes less speculative and more concrete. We are no longer assembling the continent only from chance discoveries and fishing nets. We are mapping its skeleton beneath the sea. And in doing so, we bridge two worlds, the visible and the hidden, the modern and the prehistoric. Sound waves travel through darkness and return with information. From those echoes, a lost landscape rises once more, not from myth, but from measurable reality. We are walking now through a landscape that exists only in data and imagination. Beneath the surface of the North Sea, ancient river valleys curve silently through buried sediment. Hills rise in digital relief. Lake basins rest in darkness, where sunlight has not touched for 8,000 years. Through seismic echoes and scattered artifacts, a drowned world becomes visible again. We cannot stand on its soil. We cannot feel its wind, but we can trace its contours. We can follow the courses of rivers that once carried meltwater across open plains. We can mark the high ground that endured longest against the rising sea. We can see where forests stood and where herds once gathered. Doggerland lives now in layered models, in sediment cores, in carefully mapped reflections. It exists in a quiet collaboration between fishermen, geologists, archaeologists, and engineers. It exists in the patience required to reconstruct something that cannot be seen directly. There is a certain calm in this process. The sea above remains steady. Ships pass overhead. Tides move in predictable rhythms. And far below, in cool and oxygen-poor darkness, the outline of a vanished continent rests undisturbed. We are walking through it gently, guided by echoes. If this journey into the drowned heart of our shared history brings you a sense of stillness, consider subscribing. Together, we will continue to lower our nets into deep time. We will continue to read the sediments, to follow the sound waves, and to uncover the landscapes that shaped us. The story is not lost. It is waiting beneath the tides. Imagine standing on the edge of a land that is slowly disappearing. The change is not sudden enough to feel like disaster. It is gradual, seasonal, almost understandable. Each winter, the tides reach a little farther inland. Each spring, pools of salt water remain where fresh grass once grew. The marshes deepen. Familiar paths grow soft beneath your feet. The horizon, once distant, seems closer now, marked by the quiet expansion of water. You have known this landscape all your life. You know where the rivers once ran strongest. You know where red deer crossed at dawn. You know the stands of hazel where food was gathered each autumn. But the land is no longer behaving as it once did. The elders speak of change that began long before you were born. They remember when the forest stretched unbroken for days of travel. They recall camps now lost beneath tidal flats. Their stories describe places you cannot visit anymore, except at the lowest tides, when dark shapes appear briefly through the mist before the sea returns to cover them. You do not call this loss. You call it the way of things. Still, the signs are clear. The water rises. The animals change their routes. Some do not return at all. The ground where your ancestors walked is becoming uncertain, and uncertainty cannot be hunted, gathered, or built upon. So you prepare. You gather flint tools, carefully shaped and maintained through years of use. You wrap them in hides. You carry antler points, fishing gear, the small objects that hold memory and knowledge. There is no sense of panic, only decision. The land has provided. Now it is time to follow where life continues. You look toward the higher ground visible across the narrowing channels. To the west, hills that will one day be called Britain rise as dark shapes against the sky. To the south and east lie the plains that will become the Netherlands and northern Germany. These are not foreign lands. They are extensions of a world you already know, connected by generations of movement and story. The journey is not a single departure, but a gradual migration repeated over years. A camp is abandoned when water makes it unreliable. Another is established farther inland. Paths shift. Boats become more important. Children grow up knowing routes that did not exist for their grandparents. The map of the world is being redrawn, not on parchment, but in memory and habit. At times, you return to old places. You visit the edge of a former forest, now half drowned. The trunks stand pale in the shallows. Birds no longer nest there. Fish move among roots that once held soil. The transformation feels neither hostile nor kind. It simply is. Behind you, the land continues to change. What was once meadow becomes tidal channel. What was once woodland becomes reef. Layers of peat and soil settle beneath new sediments. The sea does not erase the past violently. It absorbs it. You leave, and you do not look back often, not because you wish to forget, but because survival lies ahead, not behind. Generations later, your descendants will live entirely on lands that were once the margins of Doggerland. They will hunt new forests, follow new rivers, and adapt to coastlines that have finally stabilized. The memory of the old plains will fade into distant story, then into silence. But they will carry something forward. They will carry the knowledge of adaptation, the understanding that landscapes change, the skill of living between water and land, the quiet resilience learned during those long migrations across a world in transition. Doggerland does not end in a single moment of abandonment. It dissolves into the cultures that move beyond it. The last migration is not just a journey across space. It is a passage from one geological age into another, walked step by people who did not know they were leaving a continent behind. When we speak of Doggerland, it is tempting to describe it only as a land that vanished. But before it sank, it flourished. For thousands of years during the Mesolithic period, roughly between 10,000 and 6,000 BC, Doggerland was not peripheral to European life. It was central. It was a meeting ground of ecosystems and peoples, a region where rivers converged, herds migrated, and human communities refined their relationship with a warming world. This was not an age of stagnation. It was an age of adaptation and innovation. As glaciers retreated at the end of the last ice age, vast territories across northern Europe opened for habitation. Doggerland, with its fertile soils and abundant waterways, became one of the most resource-rich landscapes available. Forests matured, wetlands stabilized, animal populations thrived. Human groups did not merely pass through. They settled, returned seasonally, and built patterns of life that endured for generations. In such an environment, skill deepened. Stone tools became more specialized. Microliths, small, finely crafted blades, were mounted into composite tools designed for specific purposes. Fishing technology advanced, as seen in barbed antler points and harpoons. Watercraft were likely developed and refined to navigate rivers and marshes. Knowledge of tides, animal behavior, and plant cycles became intricate and precise. Doggerland's geography encouraged connection. Rather than separating Britain from continental Europe, the region linked them. Ideas, techniques, and genetic lineages flowed freely across its plains. What we now consider distinct regions were once part of a continuous cultural zone. This connectivity may have accelerated innovation, allowing communities to share strategies and respond collectively to environmental change. In this sense, Doggerland can be understood as a golden age of Mesolithic life in northwestern Europe. Not golden in the sense of wealth or monuments, but in terms of balance. People lived in close alignment with seasonal cycles. They exploited a wide range of resources without exhausting them. Archaeological evidence suggests varied diets, flexible settlement patterns, and sophisticated understanding of local ecologies. When sea levels rose and the land was gradually fragmented, something profound was lost. We did not lose towering architecture or written records. We lost a landscape that had shaped human experience for millennia. We lost the central corridor that unified early post-glacial Europe. We lost entire settlement zones that now lie beyond direct excavation. Much of what we know about Mesolithic coastal cultures comes from sites preserved on higher ground at the margins of what was once Doggerland. But the heart of that world, the low plains, the estuaries, the major river valleys, remain submerged. The most densely occupied areas may now lie hundreds of feet underwater, inaccessible except through indirect methods. It is possible that some of the most advanced adaptations to coastal living developed there. Communities living along expansive wetlands would have mastered fishing, water transport, and seasonal resource management to a degree that shaped later cultures. When those people migrated to new coastlines in Britain and continental Europe, they carried their knowledge with them. In this way, Doggerland's sinking did not erase its influence. It redistributed it. Yet the physical record of that golden age is incomplete. The central settlements, the ritual spaces, the repeated gathering grounds, if they existed, are hidden beneath marine sediments. We are left with fragments at the edges, hints of a broader and richer cultural tapestry. There is a quiet poignancy in this loss. The sea did not conquer an empty plain. It covered a thriving cultural landscape at a time when human societies were learning to flourish in a newly tempered world. It submerged not only ecosystems, but lived experience, stories, and traditions rooted in specific rivers and forests that no longer appear on any map. When we reconstruct Doggerland digitally, we are not only restoring terrain, we are acknowledging a missing chapter of human development. This was a time when people learned to navigate changing coastlines, to build flexible lifeways, to integrate land and water into a single economic system. The skills honed there likely shaped the societies that followed in both Britain and continental Europe. Doggerland's golden age lives on indirectly in the cultures that inherited its legacy. But its physical heart, the place where these adaptations matured most fully, rests beneath the North Sea. In recognizing this, we do not romanticize the past. We simply understand that history is shaped as much by what survives as by what is lost. And beneath the tides lies evidence of a Mesolithic world that was not primitive or marginal, but dynamic, connected, and deeply attuned to its environment. A golden age, preserved in silence. Doggerland is not only a story about the past, it is also a mirror held quietly toward the present. When we look at maps today, we tend to see coastlines as fixed. Continents appear stable. The boundary between land and sea feels permanent, something measured and agreed upon. But Doggerland reminds us that these lines are temporary expressions of a changing planet. What was once solid ground can become seabed. What seems immovable can shift within the span of human generations. The people who lived in Doggerland did not experience change as an abstract concept. They watched it happen around them. They adapted to rising waters, altered ecosystems, and shifting resources. They adjusted their movements, technologies, and expectations. Their world changed, and they changed with it. This is a deeply human story. It is easy to imagine prehistoric communities as distant from us, separated by time and technology. Yet their experience of environmental transformation is something we can understand intimately. They faced uncertainty about coastlines, climate, and the reliability of familiar landscapes. They responded not with control, but with observation, flexibility, and resilience. Doggerland shows us that change is not new. It has always been part of the relationship between humanity and Earth. The geological forces that shaped that vanished land are still active today. Sea levels continue to respond to climate. Sediments still shift. Coastlines still migrate. The same processes that slowly drowned Doggerland operate on scales that extend beyond individual lifetimes, but not beyond collective memory. In this way, Doggerland becomes more than an archaeological curiosity. It becomes a long perspective. It reminds us that landscapes evolve, that adaptation has always been necessary, and that survival is often dependent on the ability to move, learn, and reimagine where home can be. The descendants of Doggerland's inhabitants did not disappear when the land was lost. They carried forward knowledge shaped by transformation. We are among those descendants. The ground we walk on today feels enduring, just as Doggerland once did to those who live there. Yet beneath the calm certainty of maps lies a dynamic Earth, always adjusting, always reshaping itself across centuries and millennia. There is no alarm in this realization, only continuity. Doggerland connects us to a shared human experience of change. It tells us that our ancestors faced shifting horizons and found ways to continue. Their story is not one of sudden endings, but of gradual transitions and enduring presence. The North Sea now covers their homeland, but it also preserves it. Beneath its waters lies a reminder that the boundary between land and sea is not fixed, only paused. And in that pause, we recognize ourselves living, adapting, and moving forward on a planet that has never been still. We have traveled across a landscape that no longer appears on any modern map, yet still exists beneath the waters of the North Sea. We have felt, in imagination, the rough bark of drowned oaks that once formed dense forests across low plains. We have seen the scattered bones of mammoths and rhinoceroses that moved across open grasslands, now hidden below shifting tides. We have followed the paths of rivers that carved their way through valleys long before the sea arrived, rivers whose courses are still preserved in sediment and seismic echoes. We have listened to the quiet testimony of artifacts lifted accidentally from fishing nets, tools shaped by human hands that remind us this land was lived, known, and understood by generations who called it home. We have watched geology record both the slow rise of the sea and the profound moments of transformation that reshaped an entire region. Piece by piece, through evidence and careful reconstruction, a vanished world has taken form again. Doggerland is not truly gone. It has not been erased. It rests beneath layers of water and time, preserved in darkness, held in the memory of the earth itself. The North Sea, as we see it today, is not only a body of water, it is a covering. A vast, shifting blanket of blue laid gently over a landscape we once knew. Beneath its surface lie hills that once caught the morning light, valleys where rivers moved steadily toward distant coasts, and soils that supported forests, animals, and human lives. The sea did not destroy this world in anger. It settled over it, layer by layer, as climates shifted and glaciers released their hold on water long frozen. Doggerland reminds us that nothing in the physical world is truly fixed. The continents themselves are part of a slow conversation between ice, water, stone, and time. Shorelines advance and retreat. Land rises and sinks. What feels permanent within a single lifetime is often only a brief arrangement in a much longer process. The ground beneath our feet today carries the same impermanence that shaped the plains of Doggerland. The landscapes we know are part of an ongoing cycle of transformation, just as earlier landscapes were before them. The seabed that now seems so distant was once dry earth, and the earth we inhabit now will continue to change in ways that extend beyond our own horizons. There is no final shape to the world. Instead, there is movement, a continuous reshaping that unfolds across centuries and millennia, often too gradual to notice, occasionally marked by moments of profound transition. Doggerland is one chapter in that longer story, a reminder written not in words, but in sediment and tide. The North Sea rests above it quietly, carrying ships, reflecting clouds, and concealing the contours of a former land. Yet beneath that calm surface, the past remains present, folded into the structure of the earth, waiting patiently within the rhythm of geological time. There is a quiet comfort in remembering Doggerland. It tells us that the people who lived there faced a world that changed in ways they could not control, and yet they endured. They adjusted their paths, carried their knowledge forward, and found new places to live as the familiar landscape receded behind them. Their story is not one of disappearance, but of continuation. We are the descendants of those who adapted. Every shoreline community, every culture shaped by rivers or coasts, carries echoes of that ancient experience. The ability to observe change, to move when necessary, to reshape life around new conditions, these are not modern inventions. They are deeply rooted human traits, practiced long before history was written down. Doggerland reminds us that endings are often transformations in disguise. A land was lost, but its people were not. They walked away from rising waters and became part of the societies that followed. Their resilience flows quietly through time, embedded in traditions of travel, settlement, and adaptation that still define humanity today. To remember Doggerland is to remember that change has always been part of our story, and that we have met it before, not with certainty, but with patience and endurance. We are, in a very real sense, the children of those who once stood at the edge of that encroaching sea and chose to continue forward. Now the currents above Doggerland move slowly. The waters of the North Sea settle into their long, familiar rhythm. Fine silt drifts downward, resting gently over ancient oak roots that still hold the shape of vanished forests. The outlines of old riverbanks soften as another thin layer of sediment is laid down, patient and undisturbed. In the darkness below, the great bones of mammoths lie at peace, exactly where they were carried by time. The valleys remain. The hills remain. The landscape sleeps beneath its covering of water. There is no motion there now, except the gradual settling of the seafloor, a quiet continuation of processes that have been unfolding for thousands of years. You are far above this resting world. Here, you are safe, warm, and still. The sounds of the present are soft and distant, like waves heard from the shore. The long journey backward through time is complete, and there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to uncover tonight. Let the steady rhythm of the water carry you. Let the mind drift as Doggerland drifts, held in calm suspension beneath the tides, untroubled, unhurried, at rest. You are anchored in that same quiet, floating gently towards sleep. This has been another story, carried along the endless river of time. A world that once lived in sunlight now rests beneath the sea, and for a little while we have drifted there together, listening to its quiet echoes and tracing its forgotten paths. The journey does not end. It simply flows onward, as all histories do, moving gently from one chapter to the next. Now let that current carry you into rest. Good night, dreamer of ages, and remember to follow the channel so you never miss the next journey.